Hello and welcome to another episode of On Ramp Radio. I am Mark Parker. My guest today is William Branch. William is not only somewhat famous as a commenter around the corner, he writes a lot of stuff on Paul Vanderklay's channel, on my channel, on I believe he's been written on Christian Baxter's channel and on Luke Thompson's channel. He's prolific in the comment section, but no one's gotten to hear his voice until today. And I feel very privileged that he came on my channel to be interviewed, and it was a pleasure. And it has been a pleasure getting to know William. He was essential to helping me on-ramp into this strange little space we call this little corner of the internet, or TLC for short. And more than that, he's just become a friend, and one I hope to have for many years to come. So, welcome, William Branch.
Okay, well, this is William Branch. I want to give the curious my pilgrimage in Psychonaut Anthropology.
Okay.
I'm going to start with a quotation that will make sense. It is from a fictional character that is relevant to the story. Toda Mariko is a character in the recent release of the TV miniseries Shogun. And the story of Shogun, the book, and the two miniseries are important for my story. She says at one point, "If freedom is all you live for, you will never be free of yourself." My relationship with Japan, Tibet, and Judeo-Christianity, I'm going to describe in three parts.
Okay.
Initially, because of my mother, I was baptized as an infant into the United Methodist Church. When I was 8, again because of my mother, I received an informal first communion at the United Methodist Church. And that's my oldest memory of having a numinous or magical experience. There isn't much more to say about Christianity because my parents were not Christian.
Let me ask you again give us your age again, because that's really young, and I'm not sure everyone's going to believe their ears. Say it again. When did you have your numinous experience?
My first numinous experience was at my informal first communion at our local United Methodist Church.
And how old were you again?
I was 8.
8. That's very young. Okay. Interesting.
So my story is a bit different because since I was not raised as a Christian, I never went through deconstruction as so many other people have who were raised Christian. So where does Japan come in? Well, in 4th grade, we had a social studies section where we studied a Japanese fishing village. And in that same year, my grandfather lent me a primer on the Japanese language, which he had gotten from a co-worker who was a Japanese American gardener. And I enjoyed studying that Japanese language primer and studying about that Japanese fishing village. And that was my first exposure to Asian culture. The next thing that happened was my mom bought some old books at a garage sale. And one of these books was about Tibet. And this was at age 12. And what this book was called Penthouse of the Gods, a pilgrimage into the heart of Tibet and the sacred city of Lhasa. And I was not mature enough to read that book, but I kept it for 54 years before I was ready to read that book until the time came to read it. This book was written by the White Lama, an American who was the third American to set foot in Tibet. He was the first American ever initiated into tantric practices by the highest Lama in Tibet.
Okay.
His situation was he is a tantric hatha yogi. His name is Theos Bernard, and he is called Tibet's last emissary to the New World because he went there in the late 1930s. Then his activity when he came back to America was interrupted by the Second World War. And when he went back to the Himalayas after World War II, he was killed in a border incident with border guards. And so his career was cut short as an American Tibetan practitioner. And he is called Tibet's lost emissary to the New World. He wrote a number of books, including the one I described, and he actually completed his PhD thesis as part of the experiences that he brought back from Lhasa, which is the capital of Tibet. So that's a hook, because I didn't read that book until long, long afterward. Some years later, when I was a teenager, I encountered the book Introduction to Zen Buddhism by D.T. Suzuki. D.T. Suzuki's efforts to introduce Zen Buddhism to the Western world had a profound impact on Western philosophy, psychology, and spirituality. So this was a continuation of my exploration of Japanese culture that had started when I was 10 years old. So I'm continuing to show interest in Japanese culture. And after graduating from college, I encountered the novel Shogun by James Clavell, which is a best-selling novel. At that time, also, they did the original drama miniseries called Shogun, which has been redone this past year as a Emmy Award-winning historical drama miniseries. As part of my reading of that book and watching the original miniseries, I decided to take my first trip overseas, and I took a 2-week tourist trip to Japan. The two principal places that I visited that are of religious importance in Japan were Eiheiji Monastery, which is the principal seat of Soto Zen, that was founded by the famous Japanese Zen Buddhist Dogen. And I also visited the Todaiji Temple in Nara, Japan, which is the headquarters of the Kegon sect. And that was my experience in Japan, besides reading other things in relation to Japanese culture.
Now, how old were you when you took the trip?
I was 25 when I went to Japan, and I had a wonderful time.
And you had read D.T. Suzuki before you took the trip?
Yes, I had read that when I was a teenager, 9 years before that, and of course, I had read other uh, things related to Zen and Japanese culture since then. But I'm just bringing out the highlights
Sure.
of what were the most important elements of my exposure to Japanese culture and my interest again as a anthropology student interested in other cultures and the religions of those cultures.
Right. Well, the reason I asked was you said that the Penthouse of the Gods was too much of a book for you when you were younger, and you would hold on to it for some 50 years before you would actually read it. So
Exactly.
you came back around to it at some point. Only instead of Japan, necessarily, you went into Tibet, and
And
that's yeah. Go
yes,
ahead.
and yes, and that brings an interesting circle because, of course, there are multiple forms of Buddhism that one can be interested in. And for me, the two most interesting forms uh, in my lifetime have been the Japanese forms of Buddhism, particularly Zen, and of course the Tibetan Buddhism, which is Vajrayana. Technically, Zen and Vajrayana are both part of the Mahayana mega
Hmm.
branch of Buddhism.
Right. Right. And well, the first thought I have is on their face they seem rather radically different, but that could be just cosmetics. What do you think? I mean, Tibetan is
Well,
very loud and colorful, and Zen is all clean lines and minimalism.
yes, they are radically different from each other, and controversial because according to the Thai forest Buddhists,
Hmm.
uh, they wouldn't recognize either of those as even being Buddhism because they are too culturally different from the kind of monastic Buddhism that is practiced in Southeast Asia.
Right. Right. Thai forest being a kind of a recent fairly recent movement that was intending to go back to kind of a restorationist version of Buddhism, to go back to the original forms of
Yes,
Theravada. And
yes, yes. It is a profoundly restorationist movement that has drawn many admirers since the Second World War
hmm
as well. Of course, the interest in Zen Buddhism in the West has also been after the Second World War,
hmm yeah.
and more particularly, American interest, aside from this pioneer, Mr. Bernard, who went to Tibet all on his own. Aside from that, most interest in Tibetan Buddhism in America originated after the Dalai Lama fled Tibet to India at the end of the 1950s.
Yeah. Yeah. If there hadn't been the diaspora um, of Tibetan monks, basically, out of trying to escape the communists, it would have been locked up in the Himalayas forever. I don't. It what 7 years in Tibet was an early, and then this did this book by the Penthouse of the Gods precede or follow Penthouse of the Gods? Do you know?
Yeah, you're talking about 7 years in Tibet.
Yeah. Did it?
Yes,
Which came first? Do you
that's
remember?
that's a very interesting story in that Theos Bernard went to Tibet shortly after it opened up, after the previous Dalai Lama
Mm-hmm.
passed. They were in an interregnum between the 13th and 14th Dalai Lama, the 14th being the current Dalai Lama.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the government of Tibet, which was still autonomous, we're talking 1937 ish,
Mm-hmm.
they were autonomous from the Chinese government because of the conditions of China at that time.
Right.
Now, there had been, of course, interest in the East because of yoga
Mm-hmm.
and because of some early publications by Europeans,
Mm-hmm.
including an early version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead,
Mm-hmm.
which was put out by a British guy back in the 1920s.
Okay.
There were there were only a few Westerners of any kind who had been to Tibet or who had taken it seriously as a culture. There were other Europeans who went because they were on hunting expeditions or other non-religious activity that were allowed into the country for hunting and other things like that. But there were relatively few scholars and seekers who were able to take advantage of any opening at all in the kingdom because it was a closed kingdom relative to all foreigners.
Mm.
Now, there was, of course, some contemporary interest in Tibet in 1937 ish because of the book and movie Lost Horizons, which is a
Okay.
fictional story of Westerners who have a plane crash in the Himalayas and they end up in a magical place called Shangri La. So, this was a part of the popular culture in the late 1930s. What happened with 7 Years in Tibet, about a after uh, year after Theos Bernard went to Tibet, there was a German expedition to climb some of the tall mountains in the Himalayas
Right.
on on the British side of the Himalayas, and this was interrupted by the start of World War II in 1939. So the author of the book 7 Years in Tibet was a German mountaineer, a very accomplished mountaineer,
Right.
and he managed to escape from internment in a internment camp in British India, and he escaped over the Himalayas into Tibet, where he was able to get sanctuary until the end of World War II.
Mm.
As a result of his experiences, he got there just at the time the new Dalai Lama had been located and brought to Lhasa. So he got there. There was already the 14th Dalai Lama, but he was just a child at that time.
Right.
So
Right.
so now, excuse me because I don't recall the author's name, but he wrote a wonderful book, and then of course much later it was popularized into a movie again because of the degree to which Tibetan culture had become popular in the 60s and later.
Right.
Whereas this other guy, Theos Bernard, he'd been almost totally forgotten
Mm.
because basically all of his material, his photographs and anthropological materials were all given to the University of California and went promptly into a basement, not unlike the end of the movie Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark of the Covenant. So his work basically disappeared because there was nobody there to academically push it. It
Mm.
basically sat and gathered dust. Now, so I happened to get a first edition of his book as a result of it being in somebody's house for several decades,
Mm.
approximately 25 years in somebody's house. It ended up in a garage sale. My mother bought it for me, and that's how I got the book. So a very thin thread indeed leads from this first or third American in Tibet all the way up to my situation in reading his book.
That's really interesting. Okay, so that gives me a little grasp of the timeline now for you. And you're when we left off, you were in your 20s. You traveled to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so what happens next? You come home from Japan.
Yes,
Is
I
it
come
was
home
there
from
anything
Japan.
anything of specific importance that happened to you while you were in Japan on that trip?
Other than having a very good time with the culture and the language and taking their religion seriously, uh, nothing nothing more than what I'm describing, because I was already well read in Zen and Buddhism before I went.
Did you go in there as a speaker of Japanese?
Only as a very beginner,
Okay.
but that is a story in that part of my interest in anthropology is not only religion of other cultures, but also languages. I love practicing the study of languages.
Yes, you do. I can testify, just in our conversations privately, how many languages are you currently studying, and how many do you have some working knowledge of? Do you have any idea?
Well, I can kind of describe it a little bit. Let's go from this time period that we're talking about. At that time, basically, I have studied Russian in high school
Mm-hmm.
and have a well, I had a pretty good grasp of Russian at the time I was in high school, and then of course I had studied Japanese at a pretty young age, and then of course I restudied it again before I went to Japan. So at that time, I had some grasp of two languages aside from Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
because I had grown up in Southern California where Spanish was an expected second language.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Same here. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's then. Now we can get on with other languages as we go. That'll make more sense
Sure.
if I
Add
put
them
them
as
in
we
at the
go
right
along.
time.
That sounds
Add them as
good.
we go along.
Okay.
So basically, I'm a young man who is free to travel because I'm not married and I'm not a parent, and I'm working and I have some money. So 2 years after that, I take my second big trip. I go to Greece.
Mm.
Okay. And so the purpose of going to Greece is two reasons. One, because of the classical culture, and two, because of early Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I go to Greece for 2 weeks. I make pilgrimages to two graves: the grave of Heinrich Schliemann, who is the early archaeologist who
Mm-hmm.
uncovered Troy and Mycenae,
Mm-hmm.
and I visit the grave of Nikos Kazantzakis, who is the
Mm-hmm.
author of Zorba the Greek and The Last Temptation of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So those were two semi-religious pilgrimages I made. Was to
Wow,
those
we
was
have
to
a
those
full
two graves.
show. We have a full show just talking about the last temptation of Christ. If you ever want to pursue that, that's a fascinating that you found that. That's quite an author to admire as a young adult.
Right. Well, and my connection was primarily at that time because I wasn't a Christian yet.
Mm.
My connection was to Zorba the Greek.
Oh, okay, okay.
And that goes back to the popularity of the movie when I was in elementary school. When we would have group dancing in elementary school, we did the Greek circle dance as
Mm-hmm.
part of our movement education as a school child. So,
Mm.
of course, I forget the exact Greek name of this famous dance, but it's an easy chain dance that you can teach the kids. So,
Right.
in addition to that, I visited lots of classical sites. Most particularly, I went to the important religious site of Delphi and toured that. And then on the Christian side, I visited Corinth and Ephesus, which of course are famous for the ministry of Paul the Apostle.
Mm-hmm.
And I also visited the island of Patmos, which is famous for that as the place of exile of Saint John, the the revealer of Revelation.
Okay.
And so that was interesting. Particularly Patmos was interesting because there's a really nice Greek Orthodox monastery there that you can go see. Whereas the ruins of Corinth and Ephesus are mostly classical, but of course they have New Testament association with the letters of Paul.
Right.
So that's another aspect of my anthropology. Is I'm interested in the classics, and at that time and since, I have some facility with Latin and Greek. Are you
Mm-hmm.
there?
Yeah, yeah, I'm listening.
Yeah.
Yep.
So whenever I travel abroad, which is only twice really that I've gone beyond Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
is I always over prepare for my trip, and that includes studying the native language.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So that begins the middle part of the story. When I am 30, I meet a woman my age and we get married. And this is very important because I'm not a Christian and she is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as part of our entering into marriage, I joined the mainline church that she was a part of, which was Disciples of Christ.
Okay.
And this formed the basis of our marriage was our church activity primarily, and then later we had a daughter.
Okay.
My attraction to mainline Christianity is because I love singing and I love teaching.
Mm.
So in mainline Christianity, I was a part of the choir as a baritone, and I also joined in teaching adults various miscellaneous subjects, not Bible study per se, but other church related studies like the history of the church.
Well, you do say, calling yourself not a Christian, but you did have that experience as an 8-year-old child in your christening or baptism.
I I do have a minimalist exposure to Christianity thanks to my mother,
Mm-hmm.
who was herself not a practicing Christian,
Right.
but she was uh, essential for my initial introduction to the world of Christianity, even though that wasn't part of my upbringing.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
we have all this singing and all this teaching, and we're enjoying our marriage and we're enjoying our parenting. And then a few years later, we decide to make a commitment as a family to enter pastoral ministry, as so many other people have done.
Mm-hmm.
And this was again at the urging of my wife, who had been a Christian for most of her life. And she wanted to go to seminary and become a pastor.
Mm.
And so my job was to make it so, as well as, of course, continuing to participate in all our church activity. So we went through the 3-year Master of Divinity, and she graduated as a valedictorian in her graduating class. And she had served in a United Church of Christ as a pastor and also in a Disciples of Christ as a pastor. So we graduated, and now we are entering the difficult world of actual pastoral life as a
Yes.
family, which is many challenges. Even if you were a young man in his early 20s who has not yet made any professional or marital or parental commitments, and you only have yourself to take care of.
Sure.
That is much easier, in my opinion. It's much harder if you are 39 years old, right?
Right.
So we entered the pastoral ministry as pretty mature adults. So we are doing our thing at this point in the United Methodist Church as a pastoral family. And while we're involved in that, I find out that there's a chance to study Hebrew. And as you know, I love languages.
Yep.
And this Hebrew is being taught by a temporary teacher at the local Messianic Jewish congregation. And this Messianic Jewish congregation is part of a group, a denomination called MJAA, which is Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. And so I started going there for Hebrew. I loved the singing and the teaching. And now I'm going to 2 churches every week. I'm going to United Methodist Church, and I'm going to a Messianic Jewish synagogue.
It's a lot of church.
That's a lot of church, but we're a pastoral family. There isn't anything we're afraid of, right? So now in the Disciples of Christ, earlier I had been teaching church history. Eventually, I continued to participate in this Messianic Jewish congregation, and eventually, after the other gentleman left, he was temporary, I became the Hebrew teacher, and so I taught Hebrew.
Wow. Okay.
So
now, just really quick, your experience as a pastoring couple, were these successful? I'm just talking in terms of like PVK talks about his dying little church. Were these successful or dying little churches?
These are dying little churches.
Okay.
Because that's the kind of congregation that you will get in any denomination where you're a beginning pastor.
Oh, I see.
And
That's
this
true. That's
is because this is partially by assignment and partially by calling, depending upon the ecclesial aspect of that denomination,
Right.
And of course, you're not going to get a large or more desirable congregation unless you've been a pastor in the denomination for some time. Are you there?
Yeah, keep talking. I have to adjust something really quick, but just keep talking.
That's fine.
I'm just muting so I won't make a
We
lot of noise.
can just do a little editing. That's all.
Yep.
So yes, it is hard. This small congregation effect is also true for younger male pastors as well. We did not do any missionary work, neither urban ministry nor foreign ministry. Like sort of PVK is kind of related to those 2 areas. He's an urban minister. He's an urban missionary and a foreign missionary. So it's a struggle. Okay, and eventually, my wife and I decide to separate. And at that time, I withdraw from mainline Christianity. But I've been going to 2 churches. I'm still involved with my Messianic Jewish congregation. And so that's where I continue my religious practice activity until retirement.
Okay.
And so I was in that congregation for 22 years. So this is a big skip in time.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, so
So you started ministry in your late 30s, early
mhm,
40s, and you are working side by side with your wife for 22 years. So now you're into
not
your
exactly,
60s. Not
not
exactly.
exactly,
Okay.
not exactly. We separated,
Okay. You separate. Okay. So you
and
could after the separation, you continued still to
and
go.
sh yes, and
Okay.
she was never a part of the Messianic Jewish activity.
Right. That I understood.
She
I thought.
she has her hands full
Right.
being a pastor of a small mainline church.
Right.
Okay, so um, we were married a total of 17 years before
Gotcha.
we separated. But all of that time, I was growing in Christianity in terms of my understanding and practice of Christianity, whether it's mainline or messianic.
Mm.
So a different trajectory compared to these other folks, because again, I came to Christian practice at a later age. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have technically never fallen out of it. But we're going to get to that in the next section. Do you have any other questions about
No, let's just go on to the next section.
this large activity? Okay, now we're to the postlude. Okay,
Okay.
we have completed the midlude. Okay, so I've retired and I relocate to a different state, and therefore I have withdrawn from the Messianic Jewish congregation that I was in for 22 years. And then COVID struck.
Mm.
So during the COVID, of course, I suffered from isolation.
Mm.
There were no churches to go to because of the
Right.
lockdown. And at that time, there was no available Messianic Jewish congregation in the location that I moved to. Okay, so if I
Right.
resumed regular religious practice, I would have to choose a different congregation to participate in that would be different in practice. Not to say that another mainline church wouldn't be a good thing. Okay, but that opportunity simply wasn't available because of the COVID and the lockdown.
Mm.
So while I'm dealing with this isolation and I'm struggling with um, depression, and I've been studying and studying and studying many anthropologies and many languages and many religions, because being separated from 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 my marriage and my parenting, I have free time on my hands, and it isn't for watching Bronco football,
Right.
right? So, as a compulsive reader and somebody who is taking advantage of all the changes that happened to the internet after the year 2000, uh, I'm basically a cat and catnip. Okay, so at that point, I'm now mature enough to read that book from
Oh.
that was, I believe, printed. It was printed in 1940, that I've held for 54 years.
Okay.
And now I'm
Interesting.
mature enough to do that. And I have the opportunity to do it because I'm not being distracted by work. I
Mm-hmm.
have relatively little distraction from family,
Mm-hmm.
uh, even though my wife and daughter live in the same town as I do at this time. Uh, and we're in lockdown and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to say what made the difference other than the passage of time. Well, the crucial aspect of being mature enough to study something like Tibetan Buddhism is you have to have made your peace with death.
Exactly. Wow,
Of course,
William, you just landed a. You just did a pirouette and you scored a 10.
well,
That's brilliant insight. That's a brilliant, brilliant
I
insight.
I am actually going to echo this at the very end of what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
So, hold on. I have to
Yep.
Have to fix my computer here.
No worries.
Yeah. Well, we can always do a second take.
Oh, we're doing great, William. This is beautiful. I'm gonna keep it all in. Don't worry. It's
Well,
the folks like warts and all, to tell you the truth. So I'll
well,
accept.
I
But
think I really feel happy that I did take 24 hours to think this whole thing over and apply some meaningful structure that will help organize this for people, so it's not just a random conversation on the Hollywood squares as we often encounter.
no, we're not doing that. I can tell
Yeah,
you. This
we're
is
not.
this is beautiful. So
Okay, so
continue when you're ready.
continue when I'm ready. So, um, the death that I know is the death of my grandparents, but more particularly by this time, both of my parents have died. And I've had to face death in a serious and mature way, though thank God I still have my wife and daughter that I'm separated from, but they're just down the road from where I live right now.
And you still have a regular ongoing relationship with your
I have
daughter.
a Yes, I have a
Yeah, yeah.
regular ongoing relationship with my daughter, and my wife and I separated on the best of terms.
Right. I just didn't want folks getting the wrong idea. So
Well,
good.
well, what you said was great to bring out because so many times people separate under very bad conditions.
Right.
So I have dealt with death. And part of that was I was the sole care provider for my mother for the last 7 years of her life,
Okay.
which was a great strain because at that time I was still working full time. So
Hmm.
I was working full time. I didn't have any other relatives nearby to assist. I don't have my wife and daughter there to assist. It's myself and my mother and a neighbor to help. And I get to care for my mother for 7 years until she passes. Now, this neighbor is interesting because he is my best friend, a Lakota spirit warrior.
Hmm.
He is 3/4 Lakota, and he spent his entire working life as a care provider for senior citizens and nursing home,
Hmm.
which I consider to be a great sacrifice on his part, a great caring sacrifice because of his great care for human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And this person, of course, made himself available when there was an emergency between myself and my mother, and I needed some emergency assistance right then and there because we lived in the same apartment block, which is how I met him.
Okay.
And he knew me and he knew my mother. So he is still my best friend, and I miss him very much because he's several states away from where I live now, but we still stay in contact. And so he was a great influence in a certain uh, relative sense of he's an exposure to what you would call the native religion of North America, right? So I decide at 66 years old that I'm going to go ahead and spend a whole year concentrating on one subject. I'm going to concentrate on being a practicing Tibetan Buddhist in every which way I can, given that we're under lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
And this includes reading this book, which I'm now mature enough to appreciate because I've encountered death, which is, something that in many cases young people haven't had a lot of experience with because uh, we don't have that many, family deaths like we used to 100 years ago.
Mm.
So, as part of that, of course, I'm reading this book. I'm studying on multiple levels. I'm studying a particular Tibetan Lama by the name of Dzongsar Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, also known
Mm-hmm.
as Khyentse Norbu.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Tibetan Bhutanese Lama. He's
Mm-hmm.
also a filmmaker and a writer.
He is, and he's quite a character.
He's very much different than any other Lama.
He's very different.
He's very different, but in my understanding, he's the real thing, even though he's stepped across some boundaries. And of course, we know there are famous cases where some of the Tibetan lamas that came to the West didn't necessarily behave themselves like they should.
Mm-hmm.
But he's a lama who's always lived in the Himalayas. He isn't a guru who has transplanted himself outside of Asia like some of the others did.
Right. He didn't have Bhutan was out of immediate reach of the Chinese communists, so he had that
Yes,
um,
and
safety.
he is very familiar with Bhutan, having been born there. He's very familiar with Nepal,
Mm-hmm.
which we can give a little prayer because they had a huge flood in Kathmandu.
Right.
And he's familiar with the little kingdom of Sikkim, which is in between the two.
Mm.
So he's basically the south side of the Himalayas.
Right.
But his grandfather was the first head of the Nyingma order. That's one of the four or
Mm-hmm.
five major orders of Tibetan Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
His grandfather was the first head, or you would say an archbishop in Christian terms, the first archbishop of the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which up until that time, Nyingma had never had a head of their order. They were
Hmm.
always confederate rather than ecclesial.
Okay. I didn't know
Whereas,
that. I know about it. I didn't know that it hadn't been consolidated into
right,
under a single leader.
yes, again, a slight um, uh, deviation of conversation is to explain to listeners that Buddhism came to Tibet twice.
Hmm.
Originally, it came in the 7th century, and that was in the form of Nyingma. And that's how uh, Buddhism was first introduced to Tibet.
Hmm.
And it didn't exactly flourish initially,
Mm-hmm.
but about 400 years later, a second group of Buddhist missionaries came from India
Mm-hmm.
into Tibet, and they're the origination of the other orders
Hmm.
of Tibetan Buddhism. And
Interesting.
so in the course of their development, they developed an ecclesial structure where they basically have a head lama for their entire organization. And then of course there's different lineages that have their own heads and all that sort of stuff. So
Right. Mm-hmm.
most of Tibetan Buddhism is rather Catholic or Orthodox Christian in its form because it's ecclesial. Now, of course, this is most similar to Eastern Orthodox Christianity in that Tibetan Buddhism is entirely based on the monastery.
Right.
Okay, they basically don't have any priests,
Right.
so all lamas come up from the monastic side. Now,
Right.
it was the
They do have shamans who characters who act like shamans.
there are
Um,
shamans, there are witches, there are other characters that are part of the folk religion
Bon.
that
Right.
Bon,
It's
which is part of their Dili, which they had before there was any Buddhism there.
right. But and yet Tibetan Buddhism does try to not. They don't try to just throw it out. They try to
No,
they try to incorporate it as best they can. Um,
yes, generally,
it gets complicated and a little strange when you delve into it, but as the best as I can
yes.
remember.
Well, I during my year as a Tibetan Buddhist, I watched lots of documentaries because
Yes.
there's a lot of them available where they actually go in and they deal with oracles and they deal with
Yes.
shaman and they deal with witchcraft,
Yes.
which are all kind of associated with Bon.
And some
Vaughn,
astrology as well, which
of
probably
of
comes out of
course,
India, I'm
oh, of
guessing,
course,
more than
astrology more
Vaughn.
so than China, more so than China,
Yeah.
because historically, since the 7th century, once Tibet first became an organized kingdom, they have been anti-Chinese,
Right.
and they only allowed the Indians in because there were only a few of them.
Mm.
There were only a few Indian missionaries who came, and then those Indian missionaries trained Tibetan monks to do the whole Buddhist thing
Right.
in Tibetan
Right.
because the Tibetans didn't want to be dependent on a foreign language, whether it was Chinese or Sanskrit.
Mm.
They wanted to do everything in Tibetan. And so actually, it was the action of the early monarchy of Tibet, as well as the initial Buddhist missionaries who became the Nyingma people. They're responsible for having created the official Tibetan language and the official writing system for Tibetan.
Hmm. So
Which,
let me I may have gotten you too far afield on your
yes,
outline. Let's I don't want to run out of time or wear you out.
yes,
So let's finish your story as best we can
right.
without rushing you though. So you take as much time as you want or need.
I think we're at a good stopping pot. I just had one more thing to add. So, when the 14th Dalai Lama fled to India, along with the heads of these various Tibetan monasteries, he decided that it was not going to be a good thing for the Nyingma to not have the equivalent of a head of the order. And so he basically asked Dzongsar's grandfather to become the first head, the first official head of the Nyingma order. And
Mm.
so that's kind of where he gets his authority. Aside from delving into the whole reincarnation business, he has he is 2 generations away from basically the founder of a very old religious order in Tibetan Buddhism.
Right.
So Dzongsar would say, I have to just say in terms of things, is he points out that in Buddhism there are the 4 precepts, which is all compounded things are impermanent,
Mm-hmm.
all emotions are pain,
Mm-hmm.
all things have no inherent existence,
Mm-hmm.
and nirvana is beyond concepts.
Right.
And there's actually in this non-sectarian form, which is what he promotes a non-sectarian version of Tibetan Buddhism, is it's compatible with any kind of Buddhism, including Zen.
It is. That absolutely. That's outlined in his book for people who want to pursue it more. Why you're not a Buddhist.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm quoting from.
Mm-hmm.
So he's special in that way and is particularly relevant to my story as well as to Westerners. Now, besides that, of course, I need to mention that I was studying in particular the Heart Sutra. I've been studying that for a number of years, and I'm going to briefly quote from the Thich Nhat Hanh's English for verse 5 and 6, which kind of encapsulates the whole thing, which is, listen, Shariputra, this body itself is emptiness, and emptiness itself is this body. This body is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than this body. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness.
Mm.
So I need to mention that because, again, this ties directly into the 4 precepts. And going on a little bit further, in my year of Tibetan Buddhism, I need to quote the triple diamond, which
Mm.
is, and I'll repeat it in Pali, which is the language of South Buddhism, Bhutang Saranang Gacchami, Tamang Saranang Gacchami, Sangang Saranang Gacchami, which in English is, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is this important? because in my understanding of Trinitarianism and Christianity, this particular form of three in Buddhism is directly parallel to the standard understanding of Christian Trinity, which is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In particularly, in my understanding, Jesus is the incarnate Torah, and therefore he corresponds to the Dharma, which is the middle term. Okay? And then obviously the Sangha corresponds to the Holy Spirit, because what binds the Sangha or the congregation together is their shared spirit. That's to make a tie-in to the last point, which is to say, after a year of practicing Tibetan Buddhism intensely at home, I'm ready to go back out into the outside community. And that was a year ago.
And that helped you get through kind of the worst times of the lockdowns and the emotional impact that had on you?
Yes, and also it provides a kind of capstone learning on all the Buddhism and Asian culture that I've been studying for decades.
Yeah. So like you like me, we both ended up back in the arms of Jesus, so to speak. So
Absolutely.
You want to tell me how you got there?
It doesn't take a lot because it's only been for a year. It's not that I ever really left Christianity, as I have said in one of my comments online, is that I have spent 38 years as a Christian, but I took a year off to be a Tibetan Buddhist.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding of Christianity has changed over that time. What happened a year ago is that I was able to obtain counseling for my depression, which I was unable to obtain before that. And magically, now that was magic itself. And then magically, a Messianic Jewish congregation appeared out of nowhere.
Can I ask you very briefly, without diverting you too much, why I don't want to be, I don't want this to sound rude, but in a sense that
You're not rude at all.
what's the significance of the Messianic Jewish experience to you that makes it so important that you really weren't, that in a sense you needed it to arrive locally so that you could have a local church experience again? Is that, I mean, that's how I'm kind of taking what you're describing happening to you.
That's a brilliant question, and I'm going to be able to answer it as soon as I describe my current situation just a little bit more.
Okay.
So this is a different denomination called the UMJC, which is the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. These two, the MJAA and the UMJC, are two of the largest denominational umbrellas for Messianic congregations, which of course not exclusive to them. There are many people, whether they're in a regular Christian situation or if they're in some splinter group, because there are many splinter groups, because technically all of this Judeo-Christianity is Protestant in the sense that it's schismatic. Okay, and you know how Protestants like to schism.
Yeah.
So it's schismatic, but not entirely so, because the rabbis in both cases are actually people who are qualified to teach and lead a congregation. They're not simply a random person, right? So it's not a cult. Okay, you have cults when you have single pastors who are not part of any organization at all, who have decided that they have a message that they have to share, and they are not bound by any denominational organization, or bound or really bound all that much by a set of elders. Okay. And of course we have seen this happen in many tiny churches which really can't even qualify as a denomination because they're not integrated with the body of Christ, basically.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's an aspect of it. So what's different? I'm just going to say what's different between the two. In this case, I've moved on from happy slappy religion to
Happy clappy,
formal
William. It's happy
happy clap.
clappy. We don't slap each other. It's
Oh,
happy
well,
clappy.
you didn't go to the right Arkansas church then. You got to do the slappy part.
I missed out on that. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, so what happens then is this congregation has a broader mission in that they provide both a high church and a low church experience for those who need either of those things. So basically, for the last year, I have moved into liturgical Judeo Christianity as opposed to singing and worship
Okay.
Judeo Christianity. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, because that is what I need as a mature person. Okay. When I was dragging my daughter, my young daughter, off to the second church of the week when she was little, it was perfectly appropriate because it was a family style service, not all that different from the mainline church that we attended.
Mm.
And so the important thing of that Messianic Jewish congregation that I was a part of for a long time is the singing and the teaching, just as it had been in my other denominational experiences. Now I'm at a point where I don't need to teach, and I don't necessarily need the singing as much. I'm not in a situation where I need to provide an example for a family leader, being a family leader with children and such. Okay, there are other people who do that. And so in the first half of the Shabbat, we have a formal liturgy taken from Orthodox Jewish Siddur, which is the prayer book, which is half Hebrew, half English. It's a totally Orthodox thing
Mm-hmm.
with only a very few mentions about Jesus Christ, because for us, Jesus Christ is our messianic rabbi. Okay, he is the Messiah who came and left because he was resurrected. Okay, this is something you don't have in any proper Jewish synagogue.
Right.
Though there have been, for 2,000 years, there have been Orthodox Jews who have claimed that they were the Messiah, but none of them have risen from the dead,
Right.
regardless of what that means to you. Okay, because then we get into theology.
Sure.
So this is quote unquote, this is the real thing. And then we have a Torah service, okay, which is just like Orthodox Judaism. We have a Torah service after the liturgical service, which again is done in English and Hebrew. And the liturgical meaning of the Torah service for me is again kind of parallel to Jonathan Pajot. Okay, you have to see what the meanings of these things are. What are the meanings of actions and things that are happening, as opposed to it's just people doing some weird stuff that is inherited, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for me, when the Torah scroll emerges from the ark, which happens in any Orthodox service, that is Jesus emerging from the tomb, literally or symbolically, however you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
When the Torah scroll is brought to the podium on the bema and it is read from, that That is where the rabbi or the officiant is acting in place of Jesus as high priest in the Holy of Holies, as in the Epistle to the Hebrews. And then, of course, when the Torah scroll reading is completed and it's returned to the ark, that symbolically represents Jesus returning to heaven,
Hmm.
which of course in our Christian understanding happened on the Mount of Olives. And so basically, we are doing without getting into the entire overlap of Christianity and Judaism, is that is a literal Jonathan Pageau demonstration through body and speech of a retelling of the story of the suffering and resurrection of Jesus, which is, of course, consistent with the Apostle Paul's essential message. Okay, so that's basically we are Pauline in a Jewish way, as opposed to Pauline in a Gentile way,
Hmm.
which is nothing wrong. There is absolutely nothing wrong with any ordinary Christian service in any of their many forms. They're all very good, because that's the Pauline Gentile service. For me, it's just my peculiarity, and I always go back to the question of calling. I have been called forward into the present by the Spirit of Jesus Christ.
Hmm.
Okay, and this is where Jesus brought me.
Mm-hmm.
And if Jesus brought me to a different place, then that's where I would be.
Hmm.
So, what's the whole purpose of the last 60 years? That was to make me ready for who I am today.
Mm-hmm.
It took 60 years to make me as I am now.
Hmm.
And that all happened because of the calling. You have eyes to see and ears to hear. God, in whatever form you worship, is always with you, always calling you. And as they say in Buddhism, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Okay.
Yeah.
The Sefer Torah, which is an antique Sephardic giant Torah scroll that we have as part of our service, okay, that's the appearance of the teacher. When
Mm-hmm.
we were ready, that antique Sefer Torah scroll appeared,
Hmm.
because that is the teacher. Okay. Everybody else is just there to facilitate that, because, of course, the Torah scroll itself cannot literally talk to us.
Well, it almost what the way you're speaking reminds me of Paul when he says he tells the Corinthians, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase." It's kind of along those lines.
I have been to the exact spot in Corinth at the judicial bema, which is where Paul was judged
Mm.
by the procurator in Corinth. I have stood exactly where Paul stood,
Mm.
and that was meaningful to me even before I became a Christian.
Mm.
Because what? The seed was already there.
Yeah.
The seed was planted in my infancy, in my childhood.
Yeah.
And through various means, it got watered over time and was, quote unquote, cultivated by my wife and my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
They are the gardeners. I'm the crop.
I think we're coming to a close, but
Yes.
I wanted to ask you if you could maybe we're trying to be we, because of recent misunderstandings and difficulties we're having in the corner. We're trying to, in consultation with Paul Vanderclay privately, I'm making an effort to, and I think others are going to be too, to make an effort to try to help those who may struggle with our cross sectarian dialogue. that
Mm-hmm.
we've engaged
Yes.
in here, and maybe help them along just a little, to be a little more understanding, to try to not sound like we're just promoting heresy or trying to promote Buddhism over Christianity or Christianity over Judaism or Judaism as one form of Christianity over another form of Christianity. I'm just wondering if you could. We're not syncretists, you and I,
No, we're not. Absolutely
but
not.
but yet we're aware of a kind of beauty and support we found in Buddhism that got us through a period that I believe Jesus used, Christ
Yes,
used, the Holy Spirit
exactly.
used to get us to this place where we are
Yes,
now.
exactly.
Could you add anything to that?
Well, I think you said it very well. I think it is unfortunately incumbent upon Paul and a few of the other leaders to provide a kind of corral for this group of mixed seekers.
Mm-hmm.
Though I know that many of us are active in a congregation right now, uh, not all of us are in between or still seeking a congregation. But in a certain sense, until we get to our final destination, we will continue to seek.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my ontological view. Uh, is um, that we are formed in time reversal. It is the future that pulls us forward, not the past pushing us forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean that in a, you know, in a religious or transcendent way. Obviously, in a secular sense, we think of time going forward, but that isn't the way religion works. And I think that's always, of course, a problem for any modern apologetic, is to try to use modern concepts to explain something that's basically not modern, and is not intended to be modern because it transcends history.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I can get to an ending.
Okay.
Okay, so to end this up, we started with Shogun and Japan. So, of course, this past spring, they had the new Shogun historical drama miniseries. It's the most awarded single season of television in Emmy history.
Wow.
It's that good.
I've got to watch it then, don't
If
I?
if if well, it is an adult consumption only. Okay,
Okay.
it's only for adults, not for children, but um, it is so well done that anybody who has any affection for Japanese culture will be riveted by how well written and how well acted this miniseries is. So I'm going to quote a character from the story, which is based on a historical person. Of course, all these people are historical people, but their names and some of the details have been changed. Again, it's Toda Mariko, again, which is who I quoted from at the beginning. Here's another quote from the end of the series.
Okay.
And the other part was from the beginning of the series. Here's the end of the series in her words: life and death are the same. Both can have value and purpose. And that's my ending.
Well done, sir. Well done. We're going to have to do another one on other things because you're a fount, my friend. I
Well,
don't think people understand.
let's not wear them out, because I tried to thematically organize this
It's
as
okay.
well as chronologically organize it in a way that would kind of substitute for a rando.
We definitely will leave them wanting, and
That's the goal.
that's it, and we'll periodically release a little more as the spirit moves you, and it's been a privilege.
Oh,
I don't
thank
think I wanted to say though people don't understand. We probably have 20 hours of talking behind the scenes, just you and I. I think we've had probably eight long phone calls between us, if not
Yes.
more, and they usually go a couple hours or more. And I always come away. You were my first friend in the corner to spend a lot of time with me. CW was probably the first one to reach out to me, but you were the one who we connected at the on the Buddhist thing, and
Yes.
you watched my bio or listened to it, the first original bad sound version. And we've had a lot of fun together already, and we've only known each other what, 8 months or so.
Yes. Only 8 months. I have had the privilege of uh, showing my Christian love for you because I immediately felt called that my reaching out would be helpful to you.
Mm.
Not that you needed very much help from me after you got yourself started, but because you have been able to make yourself into a fixture of the TLC. But it was my privilege, and of course, in our subsequent conversations, those have been privileges too because I consider you a good friend.
I do back at you. And I look forward to many more conversations behind the scenes, and the occasional one up front on public. But it's being a friend to you is a definite privilege of mine, and I've learned a lot already. So thank you. We're going to end the recording right now, just with a click, and it'll take a minute.